How would you like to spend the weekend in Havana? How would you like to see the Caribbean shore? Come on and run away over Sunday to where the view and the music is tropical. You hurry back to your office on Monday, but you won't be the same anymore. How would you like to go where nights are so romantic, where stars are dancing rumbas in the sky? If you don't like to spend the weekend in Havana, you better back up on your sloppy joes.
Latin America. What comes to mind? The image of a lush tropical paradise, or poverty, violence, and tyranny? The United States points its finger at communist interference, Cuban and Soviet involvement as the source of the unrest. What are the people of Latin America fighting for? And who are they fighting against?
In all of Central America, there's been a long history of economic inequality. There have been the majority of the people who've had very little, and the small minority having the control politically, economically, and so on. I think you're seeing a history now where people simply are becoming aware of that fact, want to change that fact, and feel that they deserve to have certain basic political, economics, and social rights.
Nicaragua. Rebellion topples the Somoza dynasty, the longest-standing dictatorship in Latin American history. A dictatorship supported by the United States government for decades. How did we become involved? Investment in Nicaragua expands at the turn of the century. Encouraged by growth of trade, the United States companies take control of many coffee and banana interests. 1926, strikes on U.S.-owned plantations. Marines land to keep order. Augusto Sandino vows to free Nicaragua from foreign domination. Undefeated after 7 years, he refuses to lay down arms until the last Marine is withdrawn. Upon leaving, our forces train and arm a National Guard under Anastasio Somoza. Sandino is assassinated. Somoza establishes 50 years of dictatorship, passed from father to son.
For a long time, of course, American officials were quite pleased with Somoza. Somoza always voted with us at the United Nations. He boasted of it. He said, there's nobody else that bats 1,000 and votes at the United Nations except me. I'm the only one that always votes the way you tell us to vote.
But for his own people, Somoza does little. Half of Nicaragua's children die before the age of 5. A vast majority bitterly impoverished, while the Somoza family controls 60% of industry, more than half of the country's farmland. The National Guard keeps the dynasty in power.
The repressive measures, I gather, had finally reached a point where just about everybody in Nicaragua was opposing them. He had looted the treasury, and I forget the exact percentage of land that the Somoza family controlled in Nicaragua, but it was obscene. Just no other way to describe it.
Nicaraguans pay a high price for their freedom. After 2 years of active fighting, the country is devastated. 40,000 dead. But the jubilant victors celebrate their freedom from dictatorship. Washington cuts off aid to the new government. denouncing what we call Cuban influences.
Hay algunos que parece que entenderían mejor si nosotros dijéramos, esta revolución es como la revolución cubana. Estamos haciendo otra Cuba, pero no es así. Estamos haciendo una Nicaragua. Esta revolución es nicaragüense.
Nicaragua is reconstructing an economy devastated by 40 years of somocismo with the help of many people, many nations, from many quarters, from many ideological signs. So, no, it has not become a Russian colony. It has not been seized by the Russians. It has been seized by the Nicaraguenses, who are opened to cooperation with many nations in the world from many, many different ideological directions.
Guatemala, the Banana Republic, a major exporter of bananas, coffee, sugar. More than half of its citizens are Indian. More than 80% of them suffer from malnutrition. For most of this century, they've been ruled by military dictatorships. 30 years ago, however, Guatemala knew a brief period of democracy. 1950, Jacobo Arbenz is elected president. Almost all productive land is planted in export crops, leaving the poorest land for the peasants to farm. The United Fruit Company is the country's largest landowner. Arbenz implements a campaign promise: land reform, returning unused land to the peasants. This leads to his overthrow. The United Fruit Company rejects Arbenz's compensation plan. The Eisenhower administration steps in.
The feeling about Arbenz was that he was in the pocket of the communists, that he would enable them to take over the government and that he would put communists into key positions, and this was unacceptable as far as U.S. policy was concerned.
1954. U.S. officials meet with Guatemalan military leaders. A coup d'etat is devised.
A communist conspiracy was invented. Soviet intervention was decried, proclaimed. The CIA armed Castillo Armas, and with the full backing of the CIA, with planes, with arms, Castillo Armas invaded Guatemala from Honduras, and the democratic experiment came to an end in Guatemala. Now, this was done in the name of democracy, and it was done, it was said, to restore democracy because the Soviets had infiltrated the Guatemalan government.
Arbenz is forced into exile. Members and supporters of the reform government are purged and jailed. Peasants executed as alleged communist sympathizers.
25 years later, I would like you to reflect on the state of democracy in Guatemala, a country where any opinion maker is immediately suspected and most surely eliminated, physically eliminated, by the thugs, by the goon squads, paid for, organized, and who receive orders from the Lucas Garcia, from the military government in Guatemala.
The regime of General Lucas Garcia, considered by Amnesty International one of the most repressive in the world. Government policies support a small, wealthy class, while poverty is widespread.
Most of these people would like to see a better distribution of wealth. However, when we stop and analyze Guatemala, we must remember that there is greater poverty than there is wealth. If we were to distribute anything at this point in time, we would be distributing poverty.
Guatemala is Central America's richest country. Oil was recently discovered off its shores. But resource development forces Indians into the cities where they live like refugees. Jobs are virtually non-existent. Calls for reform are branded opposition to the government. And opposition is dangerous. Citizens become victims of massacres by death squads and by the armed forces. Nevertheless, the Reagan administration has stepped up military aid to Guatemala.
When President Arbenz of Guatemala was overthrown, the American role in the coup d'etat was not only obvious, it was something we bragged about. Well, we may have been content and proud of what happened, but all through Latin America, our hand was revealed. It was shown what we Americans would do in any country in Latin America when there was a government that we didn't like.
Anti-American sentiment grows in the 50s. Vice President Nixon's goodwill tour, a foreign policy disaster. Angry crowds meet him at every stop. What are they angry about? One answer, Nixon. Your government is responsible for the tragedy in Guatemala. The United States has intervened with military forces 12 times in Latin America in this century. Many of these invasions were led by Brigadier General Smedley Butler. In his memoirs, 1933, he says,
I helped make Mexico safe for American oil interests. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenue in. I helped pacify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests. I helped make Honduras right for American fruit companies.
Cuba. The dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista makes Cuba right for U.S. financial interests. In 1959, he is overthrown. The revolutionary government nationalizes foreign holdings. Relations with the United States turn antagonistic. 1961, invasion at the Bay of Pigs. Cuban exiles, under the direction of the CIA, try to overthrow the government of Fidel Castro. The invading forces are turned away by the Cuban people, who prove to be loyal to Castro's government. Washington launches an economic blockade of the island. Prevention of successful revolutions in Latin America takes priority in U.S. policy. We intensify counterinsurgency training.
I think probably the second major national sport during the Kennedy administration was counterinsurgency, because it was really almost an obsession. It was basically to describe how one fought terrorists and how one fought communism.
At Fort Bragg, North Carolina, home of the Special Warfare Center, a new kind of soldier has emerged, the Special Forces Trooper, the man whose specialty is guerrilla fighting. He is identified by his toughness and his skill. But the ability to survive is, of course, only part of the guerrilla's needs. In the end, his effectiveness will be measured in terms of his ability to destroy and to harass. So he becomes, finally, an expert in the techniques and the tools of destruction.
Good afternoon. I am Sergeant Wingrove, the Operations Sergeant.
Annual training sessions at Fort Bragg. Top military commanders from Latin America gather to learn the latest in weaponry and to develop joint strategies. Latin American soldiers are trained in counterinsurgency techniques. We hope to prevent popular uprisings by strengthening local military forces. Special emphasis is placed on keeping a tight rein on civilians. By 1980, more than 80,000 Latin American soldiers have been trained. The Dominican Republic. The dictatorship of Rafael Trujillo, widely hated by the people, is kept in power by the strong arm of the military. In 1961, Trujillo is assassinated.
For the first time in 30 years, the people of the Dominican Republic are breathing the sweet air of liberty. And 100,000...
The people demand a democratic government. Juan Bosch is elected president.
Acababa prácticamente de desaparecer la dictadura de Rafael Leónidas Trujillo. El mío fue el primer gobierno elegido en la República Dominicana en 38 años.
Bosch is overthrown by a military coup. Loyal army forces try to reestablish the legal government. The United States lands 23,000 Marines, fearing what we call the potential for a communist takeover.
The American nation cannot, must not, and will not permit the establishment of another communist government in the Western Hemisphere.
There was actually a list in Washington of communists alleged to be in the Dominican Republic. And there was and still is great controversy as to how many of these communists were actually there and how many of them were actually communists.
Chile. 1970. Salvador Allende, a socialist, is elected president. Chile has enjoyed uninterrupted democracy since the turn of the century.
President Nixon and Mr. Kissinger felt very, very strongly about the fact that the United States could not tolerate Allende in office, and that CIA had to take whatever steps were necessary to get rid of him.
The CIA, U.S. corporate leaders, and the Chilean military joined forces. General Augusto Pinochet leads the coup d'etat against Allende. The National Palace is bombed. Allende is assassinated.
La Junta mantendrá el poder judicial y la asesoría de la Contraloría. Las cámaras quedarán en receso hasta nueva orden. Eso es todo.
Allende was a man with considerable merit, but and also he had views that differed from ours. We would have preferred to see someone else running Chile, but it was up to the Chileans to decide. And if the Chileans wanted Allende, they should have Allende. And the question is, what the Chileans wanted, not what Uncle Sam, not what the United States wanted.
We start a democratic process, such as the one that took place in Guatemala in the 40s and 50s, such as the one that took place in Chile in the 70s. And it is promptly destroyed, promptly intervened, and promptly corrupted by the same people who create the illusion that Latin Americans are incapable of governing themselves. If there has ever been a catch-22 in history, it is this one, Mr. Benz.
In 1950, 17% of the people of Latin America lived under military dictatorships. 30 years later, in 1980, 56% are ruled by military regimes.
It was a shocking thing to read about a military overthrow in a country of Latin America and realize that the tanks that carried out the coup d'etat are American tanks, that the officers who command them are trained by Americans, and occasionally that they're men who have been trained in our military schools in this country. We have done a disservice to the peoples of Latin America in putting this emphasis upon military training. It has not increased our security. It has not strengthened us vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, because we have very few, there are very few countries in Latin America now where the people are really on our side.
El Salvador. For 50 years, the wealthy 14 families and the military have run the country by force. Today, a bloody civil war is being fought in El Salvador. the United States takes sides with the military, claiming the opposition is communist-inspired.
Anyone who looked at El Salvador could realize that its problems were more than anything else social. They were not problems of communist subversion, although the feudal families, the very wealthy families, always blamed any unrest on communists. And they were quick to come to our embassy and tell us that the Castroites had landed, that the communists had landed, and that we had to help them get rid of the communists.
May 1979. Outside the cathedral in San Salvador, demonstrators at a peaceful protest of government policies. Without warning, troops move in and open fire. The massacre, the first of many, leads to unification of the opposition. The Democratic Revolutionary Front is a coalition of establishment figures, students, and peasants. Enrique Alvarez, a popular and well-respected landowner, becomes their leader.
Y sabemos que todas las organizaciones más fuertes de este país y las que tienen mucho más afiliados pues, son ilegales y ellos las califican como organizaciones terroristas, organizaciones que no, según ellos, no están luchando por el bien de su gente.
The leaders of the true opposition, the leaders of the Frente Democrático Revolucionario, the FDR, who, believing in the word of Napoleon Duarte, of the civilians in the junta, came back last October to El Salvador. During their first meeting, they were surrounded by death squads and murdered, every single one of them. Alvarez Cordova, all the civilian directorship of the Democratic opposition, as Archbishop Oscar Romero was murdered, as Father Rutilio Grande was murdered.
My friend Enrique Alvarez, who was murdered, tortured and murdered, who was seized when he went back for conversations about the future of the country, was an outstanding person because he was a member of the 14 families himself. But as a member of the 14 families, he was appalled by the conditions in which people lived. Enrique Alvarez was ready to sacrifice everything, and in the end, he did give his life.
Guillermo Ungo, a lawyer, replaces Alvarez. He calls for negotiations.
For us, it's important to get to reach an agreement, but with the right people, with the right sectors. That is, the people who really want democracy, not the people who talks about democracy as Somoza talked. As these military governments we have talked for 50 years and have given just the opposite of democracy.
1981. The junta rules by martial law. After the 11 o'clock curfew, the sound of military trucks is heard. In the morning, bodies remain as a warning to those who oppose the government.
The junta has very little popular support. The church has made that clear over and over again in El Salvador. What has happened is that it's moved increasingly to the right, and therefore it's begun to get more and more support from the more right-wing elements and the more, I would say, violent right wing in El Salvador.
Troops scour the countryside for insurgents. Civilian casualties are often as high as 1,000 a month. Anyone suspected of providing food or shelter to revolutionaries is arrested. Their thumbs are tied behind their backs. Once they are led away, their families don't expect to see them alive again.
When I came here, my own government had told me that atrocities were being committed by both sides. In talking with victims themselves, it was continually stated that it was the Army, the National Guard, and Orden. Never, never did we hear the Popular Front doing anything along those lines.
Arms, supplies, and advisors are sent by Washington in support of the junta. The Reagan administration maintains that Cuba and the Soviet Union are the real forces behind the opposition.
It did not take the communists in 1932 to persuade the Salvadoran peasants that they were hungry. It does not take the communists today to persuade the Salvadoran people that they are impoverished, not just poor, but impoverished by the influence of other people. For the Salvadorans are people who've been made poor by the economic and social system in which they've been living. And no communist needs to tell them that fact. This is obvious.
I think the United States should have a much more liberal and far-sighted policy and understand that, first of all, these are local problems. They're not problems invented by Cuba or by the Soviet Union or by anyone. They're born from the land, they're born from the history, from the experience of Guatemala, of El Salvador, of Nicaragua. You cannot import, export revolutions. Revolutions are not tomatoes or bananas. They are grown there, and they stay there, and they obey to very local circumstances.
I think frequently the United States fails to count its own blessings and realize how very fortunate we've been. We have paid a cost in blood for our freedoms. We fought a very bloody civil war, one of the bloodiest wars in history, in order to achieve certain freedoms. And we've had internal disorders which, when you tote up, add more blood to the cost that was paid. Going back to Thomas Jefferson's comments about the tree of freedom must be frequently fertilized with the blood of patriots. And by this he meant that frequently there must be this type of unrest in order to achieve the freedoms we want. But we must recognize this is true of other nations too.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter and abolish it, and institute new government.